We've talked about the idea that there are an important difference between direct and indirect democracy. I want to move now to the idea of direct democracy in California. As you know, part of this course is to discuss the United States and its political system, but we are also going to be taking a look very specifically at California, and we're going to emphasize the ways in which California is similar to and different from the United States. And so we have come up to one of these important distinctions. They're ones that often show up on exams, so you want to make sure that this is clear down, but just to say it is that in California, we have both direct and indirect democracy. Both forms exist in California. At the national level, however, and we're going to discuss this more completely in Chapter 2, there is only indirect democracy. There is no direct democracy at the federal level, at the national level. The framers of the U.S. Constitution wanted to have some input by we the people, but they were afraid of direct democracy, and so they did not include direct democracy in the U.S. Constitution, and we do not have it at all. So what we want to talk about is, because in California we have both direct and indirect democracy, and so just as an example, for indirect democracy in California, just as we do at the national level, we have a legislative branch, and that legislative branch is divided into two houses, the state senate and the Senate filled with representatives. We elect those representatives, and those representatives make decisions on our behalf. In California, we also have an executive branch. The executive branch is made up of a lot more officers that we get to elect. So we have a governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, an attorney general, superintendent for public instruction, etc. There are a lot more offices. It's called a plural executive, which we'll talk about in the last week of the course when we talk about the executive branches at the national level and in California. But in those instances, we elect those individuals who then make decisions on our behalf. An important distinction in California is that the judicial branch, if they want to run for re-election, then they are also going to be representatives who are going to make decisions on our behalf, and we have a way to weigh in on them. Whereas at the national level, the judicial branch is chosen by the president, confirmed by a majority of the U.S. Senate, and then they serve for life. So there is no way in which we, the people, or even have any say over who is in the judicial branch. But the idea here that we're talking about is at the state level, we have both examples of direct and so we want to talk a little bit about the three types of direct democracy in California that we have. There's an initiative, a referendum, and a recall. The initiative is the one that comes closest to the idea of direct democracy. Citizens can bypass the legislature and pass their own laws. And as your textbook talks about, because you have a textbook that talks about the American political system, and then you also have the California Politics Supplement that is also bound together, and so you want to make sure that you're taking a look at that to get some of those details, is one in which the citizens can bypass the legislature and pass their own laws. And the ways in which that happens is, in the first stage, you need to collect signatures of the people who voted in the last gubernatorial election or the last election for governor. That's the gubernatorial is the name for a governor election. Or change to be an amendment to the California Constitution, you need to collect more signatures, and that's 8% of those voting in the last gubernatorial election. If that is certified by the Secretary of State in the state of California, then it's a majority vote of the California voters. If they say yes, that change, whether it's a law or if it is a constitutional amendment even to the California Constitution, then becomes the law of California. A referendum is that the legislature asks the voters for their input. It starts with 2/3 vote of the legislature. If 2/3 of the legislature says, yes, this is an issue we want the public to weigh in on, then it is sent to us as voters. And if a majority of us say yes, whatever they asked of us will happen, and if a majority of us say no, then it doesn't happen. The final one is a recall, that even though there are periodic elections, as there are at the national level, government officials in California can be removed from office during their term in office. So if you don't want to wait until the end of the 4-year term for the governor, for example, if enough people are unhappy about the way in which things are going, or they don't like the governor enough, if they can collect signatures totaling 12% of those who voted in the last election for the office where the recall is being contemplated, then be put on the ballot, and if a majority of the voters decide to get rid of that government official, they will, and then a new election is held to fill that position. And again, if a majority say no, the person stays in office. And so if you want details about this, you could ask Governor Gray Davis, who in the early 2000s was recalled by the California because he raised the fees on registering your vehicles, and people were unhappy about those changes for other reasons as well. Even though he got re-elected, he was removed from office for the recall, and that's how Governor Schwarzenegger became the governor of California. Okay, so another distinction we have is between procedural and substantive democracy. Procedural democracy is the idea that democracy exists as long as the procedures are democratic. And what are those procedures? We're going to talk a little more specifically about that in the next set of lectures when we talk about the ideas of popular sovereignty and what it looks like. But for now, the procedures we usually think about when we talk about procedural democracy is we say something is democratic procedurally if it is one person, one vote, and there's majority rule. That means that procedural democracy can apply to direct and indirect democracy. We do not demand that the people decide directly on these issues. What we're really emphasizing in procedural democracy is the procedures, the rules of the game. And is it one person, one vote? And if it's majority rule, then we would say that it is procedurally democratic. A terminology that is used to describe this is it's a fairly thin form of democracy. And so all you're saying is if you have elections, it's one person, one vote, and there's majority rule, that thing is procedurally democratic. Others argue that this is not enough to ensure democracy, that what we want from democracy is other aspects, and simply saying that the procedures whereby the decision was made was democratic is not sufficient. And so some argue instead for a different definition, substantive democracy. Democracy is more than a process. What happens in substantive democracy is that the outcomes matter more than simply the decisions that are made. And so really what they're talking about is the concern that, yes, you may have a good outcome, but if it was decided undemocratically, then that might be a problem going forward. Some people have argued this in terms of in Venezuela, where the former President Chavez provided quite a bit of things for poorer people who had been ignored by previous governments in Venezuela. And so they would argue that it is substantive democracy because he's providing health care and jobs and all of these things to people who had been ignored by the Venezuelan society for a long period of time, is that if the procedures whereby the decisions were made were not democratic, but the outcomes are, who's to say that that individual will always be doing what is right? And that leads to the other question, is to say that substantive democracy has this idea of what is good, but who decides what is good? What are the definitions, and who gets to contribute what is good? The people who get to decide what is good and what is bad, what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. And these are two extremes, the idea of procedural democracy and substantive democracy. And again, a lot more can be said about this theoretically, and if you want to take upper division level political science courses, I invite you to do so. But just to give us a sense, we can see that this is a major debate. And like we generally find is that we have a mixture of both. We need both procedural and substantive democracy. And we take a look at those things, we see that there is this blending. And what I want to move to is the way in which this textbook actually defines democracy, the idea of the democracy standard that is described in the first chapter of the textbook. And in many ways, you can see it as a way to combine substantive and procedural democracy. According to your textbook, for a representative, there needs to be three separate components: popular sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality. Popular sovereignty is the idea that government policies will reflect what the people want. And that's a very straightforward one, is what we want and what we get are very close to each other, the idea of popular sovereignty. The idea of political liberty is that there are basic formation, expression of the popular will and its translation into policy. And we're going to talk a little bit more specifically in the next lectures about what talking about. But you can see that this idea of freedom is an important component to this democracy standard. And finally, there is this idea of political equality. And that is the idea that each person carries the same weight in voting and other political decision making. And when you take a look at that definition, that if you have to have democracy, in order to have democracy, you need a popular sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality, you can see that there are contributions that those make to both procedural and substantive democracy. And so the definition that the textbook uses is one that's saying we need to have both substantive and procedural democracy. And so this idea of this democracy standard of popular sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality is so important to the structure of the textbook. It's the main reason why I've used this textbook as part of this course, is that they will talk about this issue of popular sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality in every single chapter of the textbook. It's just to make sure that it makes a lot of sense, this idea of popular sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality, the ways in which they can expand on those, the ways in which they actually interact with each other and might actually conflict with one another, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, is something that you can see as a key struggle that is this idea of the struggle for democracy. It's written in section 1.1, the idea of what is democracy, so make sure you read that and reread that so that it's very clear to you. The first writing assignment that I'm going to have you do for the end of the week is going to have you think about the ways in which at least one of these, or maybe some of these, interact with our political system. And so it's so important that the next lecture is going to be a discussion of popular sovereignty, political, with an emphasis on what they are, how they can be expanded, and also the ways in which they conflict with one another and why that becomes a fundamental struggle to the idea of democracy.